Good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf is Lamed Beis. We're actually going to pick up from Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Just to reorient ourselves a little bit, let's actually go back a few lines. We're going to start 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So Amar Shmuel, we read this yesterday, but just because it's all part of the same sugya, it's easier to start from here. So Amar Shmuel, Chosama Shebekarka. Remember again, this is a case of where you're tying down, let's say, the lid of a pit or of a cistern, a cave. You're tying it down to the ground. So the Shmuel says the halacha is matir avalo mafkia. You can go ahead and untie the knot, but you may not unravel it. Velo chotech, nor may you cut it. Now Shmuel's logic is because since the rope is attached to the ground, what you do to the rope ultimately again could be an issue of binyan or stira. In this case, demolition. I think anything attached to the ground has the status of a structure of the ground as well. So therefore, Shmuel says that you could untie the knot. It's not an issue of matir, of untying, since this is a knot that is omed, that is meant to be untied, but you may not cut it or unravel it. And Shmuel says, Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yom Tov. This is true on Shabbos as well as on Yom Tov. So the Gemara raises a kasha. Meisvei, the Gemara says, Meisvei, Chosama Shebekarka, when you have again the same case of these knots that are tied onto the ground, you could go ahead and untie it, but you may not unravel it, nor may you cut the rope. Biyom Tov, that's on Shabbos. B'Yom Tov matir umafkia v'chotech, but yet on Yom Tov you are permitted to do all of these things. So both say this seems to contradict what Shmuel just said, because Shmuel did not make a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov, and both for Shabbos and Yom Tov Shmuel said that you could untie it, but you may not unravel, nor may you go ahead and cut the rope. So the Gemara says, whose opinion is reflected in the Bryce? So Hamani, Rabbi Meir, this is Rabbi Meir, the Amar. Af poches lechatchila. That's Rabbi Meir of our Mishnah. And remember again what Rabbi Meir of our Mishnah said. Rabbi Meir was talking about the case of where the fruit was sealed up in a house with a brick wall. Again, the bricks were not cemented with each other, but a brick wall nevertheless. And Rabbi Meir felt that you're permitted to lechatchila remove the bricks in order to access the food. So you see that Rabbi Meir allows for certain even dramatic activities for the sake of ochel nefesh. Upligi Rabbanan alei, and the rabbis argue on Rabbi Meir. Va'ana darmik Rabbanan, and I hold like the Rabbanan. Fine. So it says the Gemara, Umi pligi Rabbanan alei, bichos sama shebekarko. Do the Rabbanan argue with Rabbi Meir when it comes to the case of knots that are tied on the ground? V'atanya, we learned, Modim Chachamim Rabbi Meir b'chosama shebekarka, but yet we learned that the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Meir when it comes to the knot, these particular knots to fasten things down to the ground. That's what Shabbos matir avalo mafkia. That on Shabbos you're permitted to go ahead and untie it. However, you can't unravel it. V'lo chotech, nor may you cut the rope. B'Yom Tov matir umafkia v'chotech, and yet on Yom Tov you are permitted to go ahead and what? You're permitted to go ahead and do all of these things. You can not only unravel it, but not only untie it, but you could unravel it and cut it top of Lamed Beis. Suppose you see from here that the Rabbanon seem to be in absolute agreement with Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, "Hu da Amar ki haytana." He holds like Shmuel holds like this particular Tana. What's the Tana say? This Sanya. Chosamos shebekarka matir avalomafkia v'lo chotech. So this particular Tana said that if you have knots that are tied to the ground, you can untie them, but you may not unravel them, nor may you cut them. Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yom Tov, and that applies both on Shabbos as well as on Yom Tov. B'shebekli, but again, if you have a rope tied around the utensil, matir avalomafkia v'lo chotech. Then on Shabbos you can go ahead and untie it, but you may not unravel it, nor may you cut it. However, Yom Tov matir umafkia v'chotech. But on Yom Tov itself, you would be permitted to go ahead and what? Untie, cut, and unravel, or untie, unravel, and cut. So we'll say again, you see over here that Shmuel has a Beitzah on which to base his opinion on, and in this particular Beitzah, we are mechalik. We in fact do make a distinction between what we do on Shabbos and what we do on Yom Tov. Taratzte l'charesha. You have now explained the first part. Ela seifa kasha. But the seifa. Rashi points out over here. Taratzte l'charesha. The milsa the Shmuel b'chosama shebekarka the Messiah haytana. So now you brought a proof to Shmuel's position. Fine. However, seifa kasha. The Amar Shmuel v'shal kelim afilu b'Shabbos matir umafkia b'chotech. V'haitana tani v'shal kelim b'Shabbos matir, avalom avkir v'lo chodech. Rabbi say, here's the issue. You've now answered up the first case of the knots attached to the ground on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But there was a second case. The second case was, what happens if you have a rope tied around a kli? So remember, again, Shmuel holds that a rope tied around the kli can be untied, unraveled, and cut even on Shabbos. What was the logic there? Remember, we said this yesterday. The logic there was, thank you. The logic there was that lemaisa, ein binyan ustira b'kelim. There are no acts of building or demolition by utensils. Remember, the whole issue over here of cutting, unraveling, untying a rope is an issue of soser, an issue of demolition. You are undoing something. But that issue of demolition only applies to what? Something that's attached to the ground. Shmuel therefore said, when it comes to, let's say, a rope tied around the utensil, you could do whatever you want with that rope. And yet, what did the Beitzah say? The Beitzah ever did not agree with this position. To which the Gemara says, no. Hamani, whose opinion is reflected here? Whose opinion is reflected? So again, both sides, the Beitzah said that with a kli, b'Shabbos matir avalom avkir v'lo chodech. B'yom tov, remember, whereas Shmuel allowed for the untying, unraveling, and cutting of the rope around the utensil, both on Shabbos and Yom Tov, the Beitzah only allows those activities on Yom Tov, but on Shabbos, all you're permitted to do is untie. So the Gemara says, so whose opinion is this? Hamani, Rabbi Nechemiah. Oh, I'll tell you, whose opinion is this? Rabbi Nechemiah. We'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Hamani Rabbi Nechemiah. Kilamar the olam mutar lafkia v'lachtoch de'in ba mishum stira. In reality, you are permitted to go ahead and untie, unravel, and cut the rope even on Shabbos. Even on Shabbos, right? Because again, there's no steer, there's no demolition. Ulahai tano gufei im yachal lahafkia ulenatik biado shari v'huda ka'asir mishum tiltul sakin ka'asar Rabbi Nechemiah. Rabbi said, listen to this. So the Gemara now is suggesting that the reason that the Beitzah does not allow you to untie or to unravel or to cut the rope on Shabbos is because to unravel or to cut a rope, you require what? You require a knife. And this Beitzah is reflective of the view of Rabbi Nechemiah. What does Rabbi Nechemiah say? Rabbi say this will take us back to our Shabbos days. The Amar kol ha'kelim ein nitalin ela derech tashmishan. Rabbi Nechemiah holds that lemaisa, a utensil, can only be moved for a specifically designated purpose. So what purpose does a knife have on Shabbos? Right? Cutting food. And therefore the act of cutting or unraveling a rope is considered to be an unnecessary or inappropriate usage of the kli. Therefore Rabbi Nechemiah has a very restrictive view of muktzah. He holds that now you can only move it for a specifically designated purpose. That's why the Gemara is suggesting that the Beitzah that says that on Shabbos you may not go ahead and unravel or cut the rope around the utensil is reflective of the view of Rabbi Nechemiah. It has nothing to do with the rope in reality. It has nothing to do with an issue of stira, of demolition. It has to do with an issue of muktzah, that you cannot, according to Rabbi Nechemiah, move a knife for this particular purpose. So the Gemara says, 1 second. I Rabbi Nechemiah might your Shabbos, I feel Yom Tov Nami. But I will say, the Gemara says that doesn't make sense. Well, not that it doesn't make sense, but then there's a kasha. Because what did the Beitzah say? When can't you unravel or cut the rope? On Shabbos. But the Beitzah allows you to do it on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, if you're telling me that this is the position of Rabbi Nechemiah, Rabbi Nechemiah's view would apply the same way on Shabbos and Yom Tov. In which the case, the same way that he restricts you from moving the knife to unravel or cut the rope on Shabbos, he would also restrict you from moving the knife to unravel or cut the rope on Yom Tov as well. And yet, the Beitzah makes a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Beitzah said that unraveling and cutting is asur on Yom Tov, on Shabbos, but permitted on Yom Tov. Maybe you'll say that Rabbi Nechemiah holds that there's a difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Literally, resting on Shabbos versus resting on Yom Tov. Meaning, maybe you'll tell me that Rabbi Nechemiah has different standards of muktzah by Yom Tov than he does by Shabbos. Suppose again, that's not a crazy thing to say, because at the end of the day, we know that there are certain built-in differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Maybe Rabbi Nechemiah only holds this strict view of muktzah by Yom Tov, but not by Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, but is that true that Rabbi Nechemiah make a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov? V'hatani we learned, v'hatani chada, masikin kelim, ve'in masikin b'shivrei kelim. So we'll say, now the Gemara is going to call 3 braisos. But yet we learned in one brisa, that's what? You can go ahead and on Yom Tov, you could burn utensils, but you may not burn broken utensils. Now, both say the assumption over here, if you look at Rashi, Masikin Kelim, Rashi says, Debere tiltal namininu, umetaltal nami lasikon, that if I want to take a utensil that is perfectly permitted for use on Yom Tov, and I want to use it as fuel for a fire, I have that right to do that. However, you may not fuel your fire with broken utensils. Now, the assumption over here is what kind of shivrei kelim we're talking about. Utensils that broke on Yom Tov. So meaning I can't use those. Why? Because now effectively those are muktzah. Those are muktzah. Because they were not fit for fuel at the time of the onset of Yom Tov, and therefore they're muktzah. Fine, that's brisa 1. Kanya idach, a second brisa. Masikin bein mekelim bein b'shivrei kelim. Second brisa says that what? No, you could fuel a fire both with utensils as well as with broken utensils. Okay. Now, also the assumption is that the Tana of that particular brisa just has a very relaxed view of muktzah, and therefore allows you to use everything. The Tanya idach, and a third brisa said, "Ein masikin lo b'kelim, lo b'shivrei kelim." And I will say, only we have these kind of teachings, right? And the third brisa says that what? You may not use either. You may not use whole utensils or broken utensils for fuel for the fire. And the Gemara says, "Umishani lo kasha." They're not contradicting each other. There are 3 different opinions. Harabi Yehuda, Harabi Shimon, Harabi Nechemia. To which the Gemara says 3 different opinions. The first price that says that you can use whole kelim, but you can't use broken kelim. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda takes a stricter view of muktzah, and therefore he says you can't use the broken kelim for fuel. Why? Because Lamai said they were not usable for fuel at the onset of Yom Tov, and therefore they're muktzah. Second brisa that says you can use both is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon takes the relaxed view of muktzah, and therefore says even broken utensils you can go ahead and use. And the third opinion that says you may not use either is who? Is Rabbi Nechemia. And Rabbi Nechemia Rabbosai holds that what? That lemaisa, you may not move a utensil for any other reason other than its primary designated use. Which utensils is not for fire, it's for what? It's to, to hold something, to store something. So therefore I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that even on Yom Tov, Rabbi Nechemia is of the opinion that what? That a utensil may not be moved for its non-primary purpose. This therefore refutes what we just said before. So remember, we're trying to find the author of the Beitzah. And the author of the Beitzah said that on Yom Tov, if you have a kli, if you have a utensil that's tied, that's let's say closed, it's tied, the opening is tied by a rope, it's sealed off by a rope. So the Beitzah said that on Shabbos you may untie it, but you may not unravel or cut. On Yom Tov you may unravel and cut. So the Gemara wanted to suggest that, remember, whose opinion is that? That's Rabbi Nechemia. That's Rabbi Nechemia. Right, going back to the previous, that's Rabbi Nechemia. And what's the issue? The issue is not one of stira, not one of demolition, but rather one of transporting a utensil for its non-primary purpose. And the Gemara was suggesting that perhaps Rabbi Nechemia has a difference of opinion by Shabbos and Yom Tov. By Shabbos he's stricter, and therefore does not allow you to move the knife for its non-primary purpose of unraveling or cutting the rope. But on Yom Tov he would allow it. Now we just see from the Beitzah just quoted that Rabbi Nechemia holds to his guns. He holds to his position both by Shabbos and by Yom Tov, and holds the same way that both on Shabbos and Yom Tov you may not move a utensil for its non-primary purpose. Which then leads us back to square one. Who is the author of the Beitzah? To which the Gemara answers, Shrei Tanoi Vali B'Rabbi Nechemia. In reality, Rabbi say there is a machlokes. There's a dispute about what Rabbi Nechemia holds. According to one approach, Rabbi Nechemia holds the same position by Shabbos and by Yom Tov, and holds that a utensil may not be moved for any other reason other than its primary designated purpose. That's one approach. And the other opinion of Rabbi Nechemia, meaning the other view of Rabbi Nechemia's opinion, is that in fact he does make a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov and would allow you to move the knife even for its non-primary purpose on Yom Tov, which would then, and therefore again, the view in the Beitzah would be reflective of this second view of Rabbi Nechemia. Okay. One of his views is like Shmuel, correct. Or that Shmuel's view is reflected in the Beitzah as well, correct. Says the Mishnah, Ein pochasin esaner mepnei shu'osakli. But another very interesting case. You may not go ahead. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Eid pokus in asaner literally means you may not hollow out a candle. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. In pokus in asaner, litol echad min habeitzim shel yotzer. You can't. Now, we'll say what this literally means is you can't take one of the eggs of a craftsman. Belitchov egrofo lusocho lachkok ner. So we'll say, listen to this. Now, what does it mean? The eggs? It doesn't mean the egg. What it means is that craftsmen used to go ahead and have balls of clay. They had balls of clay. They call those beitzim. So they would take these balls of clay. They had like ready-made balls of clay, and that's what they would fashion. So we'll say a nair literally is not like a candle, but rather again is a receptacle for a little bit of oil and the wick. Right? So how would you go ahead and make a nair out of a ball of clay? You would take the ball of clay and you would put your fist in there and you would pound out, you would just or knead out, I should say, an opening for oil and for a wick. So the Gemara Mishnah says, you may not do that on Yom Tov. You may not do that on Yom Tov. Now I will say, the reason for that is, Rashi says, because you are literally fashioning a utensil. Now the issue of fashioning a utensil on Yom Tov is not really one of boneh, it's not really one of building, it's more what we call makeh bepatish, right? It's the idea of finishing something, of fashion. Again, there's a whole dispute about what makeh bepatish is. Is it makeh bepatish, one of the malachos, is makeh bepatish, without getting into all of that. The point is, it's malacha, and therefore you can't do it on Yom Tov. Ve'in osin pachamim b'Yom Tov. Furthermore, you can't make charcoal on Yom Tov. Now, this is actually very interesting. Rashi says over here, because the charcoal itself is considered to be a utensil as well. You're creating something. Now, what was charcoal used for? We'll say, interesting, charcoal was not used for cooking in the times of the Gemara, in the times of the Mishnah. Rather, what charcoal was actually used for was litzarfei zahav. It was used for people who were smelting or forming gold. So therefore, again, you can't make charcoal on Yom Tov because the Mishnah considers that to be the creation of an object. And you may not go ahead and cut a wick. So I'll say this would seem to be if you have, let's say, a very long piece of material that you want to go ahead and use for a wick, but it's too long right now. You can't cut it down to size because in essence you are creating a new utensil as well. Rabbi Yehuda says, Chot chaba'ar. You can't cut it with a knife, but you can go ahead and cut it with the fire. So we'll discuss what that means. What perhaps that means is you may singe the wick in such a way that the part that you don't need burns off. So we'll see that in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Man tana de pechisas ner manahu. Who is the opinion who holds that the creation, pechisas ner literally means the hollowing out of the ner, of the clay to make this ner, is considered to be the creation of a utensil? Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Meir, it reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir say? This sanya, kli chares me'emasai mekabel tumah, because the Beitzah said, when does an earthenware utensil? When is it mekabel tumah? Mishenigmara melachto divrei Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir holds as soon as you have finished working it. Rashi says, Mishenigmara melachton chaki kasam, as soon as it's hollowed out. And I will say, understand, for the making of earthenware, there are two parts. There's the actual creation, the hollowing out of the utensil, and there's the placing of it in a kiln or in an oven to fire it up and to harden it. Rabbi Meir holds that an earthenware item is considered to be a utensil even before it is hardened in an oven. Just the act of hollowing it out, by definition, creates its utensil status. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, misheyitzrafu b'kisha. No, it's only considered to be a clean when what? When actually it's fired up in the oven, when it's forged in the oven. So both it would appear that our Mishnah that says that you can't take a ball of clay and hollow it out on Yom Tov would seem to reflect the view of Rabbi Meir, who holds that just simply the act of hollowing it out is in and of itself the creation of a kli. Only Abaye, mimai. So first Abaye says, 1 second, who says you can compare these two cases? Because remember, both the Gemara is quoting over here the din of Rabbi Meir by Tumah. By Tumah. Rabbi Meir says that a kli cheres is mekabel Tumah at the time that it's hollowed out. The Gemara is extrapolating from that since Rabbi Meir holds that once it's hollowed out, it's mekabel Tumah, that means that what? That its status as a kli occurs when it's hollowed out, and therefore our Mishnah reflects that view. Comes along Abai and says, 1 second. How do you know to compare those things? Mimai. Dilma ad kan lo kam Rabbi Meir hasam ela dechazi lekabule b'midi. So maybe here's the difference. Why does Rabbi Meir say that when you hollow out an earthenware utensil that's considered to be a kli? Because once you hollow it out, Rabbi said, it has what's called the base kibul. It has a receptacle. And the primary definition of a utensil is something that has a receptacle. Aval, l'hacha, l'maychazi. But over here by the lamp, once you hollow it out, what is it going to be used for? Rabbi say, apparently, you can't actually use that hollowed out piece of clay for a lamp for the simple reason that before you go ahead and forge it in fire or fire it up, so the mice again, if you put oil in there, you know what happens? The oil will get absorbed into the clay itself. So the Gemara therefore says that I understand why Rabbi Meir holds that once you hollow out as mekabel tumah, because once you hollow it out, you're capable of what? Of using it as a receptacle. Therefore, it has status of a kli. But who's to say that just because you hollow out a piece of clay, that it becomes an air? It's not even usable as an air yet. To which the Gemara says, no. L'may chazi, l'kabule be pshiti. Because the Gemara says, once you hollow out this piece of clay, even though it's not yet usable for an air, for a lamp, you know what it is usable for? You could put your money in there, right? You could put coins in there. Or in other words, again, it might not be usable yet for a lamp, but the act of hollowing out the piece of clay, you have created a significant utensil. Granted, you can't use it for your intended purpose yet, but lamaisa, it is still a usable kli, and therefore you may not go ahead and do it on Yom Tov. Ikeda Amri, others say, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadoki, that our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok. How do we know that? This nan. Alphasin charonios. Now we'll see this right now. Look at Rashi. Alphasin charonios. It's the second white line in Rashi. Mefarish Takaman, the Gemara will say this explicitly later on. These are ka'aros shel b'nei ayaros. These are the plates of simple villagers. Inon b'nei krachim gedolim. These are people who do not live in a large city. Ve'in makpidin al kelim noim. And therefore they don't really care so much about nice utensils. And what do? Umishenifsheta haka'ara shel cheres ochlin babasar ve'in mamtinin ashetischakek v'tetzarit pikivshan. So we'll say, listen to this. So normally, when you're making a plate, so how do you make a plate? So if you were to make a plate out of clay, the first thing you do is you'd flatten out the piece of clay, but then what would you do? So plates, remember, are not flat, right? Plates have an indentation in it. The middle is lower than the sides. So you would then depress, if that's the right word, you would depress the middle and or raise the sides, whatever you would do. So apparently the simple villagers, they were simple individuals, so they would just simply flatten out the clay and already use that as a plate to go ahead and eat meat. Again, obviously you can't use it for anything with liquid or with gravy, but for simple solids, they would go ahead and use it. So the Gemara says, Alphasin charonios, that's what it's called. So these are the plates of villagers. Tahoros ba'ohel ames, utmeos b'masa hazav. Are what Rabbi say? If this villager's plate happens to find itself under the same roof as a corpse, so ultimately again, it is tahor. It is tahor, but yet it is tameh if it's touched or picked up or moved by a zav. What's the logic over here? Look at Rashi. Tahoros ba'ol ames, diligabe ohel ames, ba'inon toch likli cheres tichsiv v'chol kli pasuach, mashma diyesh lo pesach. So here's the difference. When it comes to Tumas Ohel, the Torah explicitly discusses the idea that a kli chares, an earthenware utensil, becomes tamei from its inside. I.e., in order for a kli chares to become tamei, Tumas Ohel, Tumas Meis, it must have a receptacle. If it doesn't have a receptacle, then by definition it does not become tamei Tumas Meis. On the other hand, when it comes to Tumas Zav, when it comes to, let's say, being touched or being carried by a zav, that is tumah that is contracted from the outside. Because it's contracted from the outside, therefore what? Therefore it does not require a receptacle. Therefore, if you have this flat plate, it is not mikabel tumas meis, but it is mikabel tumas hazov. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok Omer, af tahoros b'masa hazov. Rabbi Eliezer bar Yaakov says, no, it is even tahor from becoming tamei by being touched or carried by a zav. Why? Lefi shelo nigmara melachton, because lemaisa it is not yet complete. It is not yet a complete kli, and any object that is not yet a complete kli is not subject, cannot be makabel tuma. Look at Rashi. L'tishal nigmar malachton chakikasan hu nechkeku mitumas midiiflog ba'alfasin am Rabbi Eliezer chakika mashlemonis. So I will say, what do you see from here? Rabbi Eliezer by Yaakov comes along and Rabbi Tzadok says, no, this plate, this flat plate, is not even makabel tuma from a zav. Why? Because the Maisa, it's not complete. Why is it not complete, Rabbi Osai? Because it has no base kibble, because it's not been hollowed out. What do you see from here, according to Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok? That the definition of a kli is what? Something that is hollowed out, which would seem to reflect very beautifully in our Mishnah. Because what does our Mishnah say? If you take a piece of clay on Yom Tov, and you go ahead and you hollow it out, you have created a kli, and you're chayiv for that. This would seem to reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok. To which the Gemara says, Amalei Abai. Abai says, 1 second. Dilma ad kan lo kam Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Tzadok hasam el de chazil kabule beimidi. So no. Maybe here's the difference. The difference over here is that maybe Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Tzadok says, in that case, look at Rashi, de chazil kabule midi mishenichkeku umiu kodem chakika lo de sofan lichakek. So we'll say it's only in a case where lemaisa the object has the ability to go ahead and actually hold something that Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Tzadok would say that it's a kibble that has a base kli. Aval hochala my chazi. But here, what is it usable for? To which the Gemara gives the same answer. Likabule be pshiti. It is usable in some, even though it's not usable for an air, but it's usable in some basic form to be able to go ahead and hold coins. Okay, says the Gemara. The Gemara just goes back for just a moment. Tan Rabbanan in pochas and asaner. We have a brayso that supports this as well. You may not go ahead and hollow out a piece of clay to be used as an air on Yom Tov. Furthermore, ve'in osin alfasin charanios b'Yom Tov. You may not go ahead and make these alfasin charanios. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel matir ba'alfasin charanios, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel allows you to go ahead and make alfasin charanios. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel holds that Lamaisa the alfasin charanios do not constitute a kli because there is no depression, there is no base kibble. Therefore, he allows you to make it on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, by the way, my charanios. What does charanios mean? Rav Yehuda iranios. Okay, my iranios. That's very helpful. What is iranios? Abaye tsoi chakliyasa. I will say tsoi means plates. Chakliyasa means villagers. These are the plates of simple villagers. Ve'ein osin pechamin. And now the Gemara goes on. So okay, so now we've taken care of the first part of the Mishnah, that you may not take the ball of clay and go ahead and hollow it out. We have two different possibilities, either Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok, as to whose opinion is reflected here in the Mishnah. So now the Gemara moves on to the next case. You can't make charcoal on Yom Tov. And I will say, remember again, the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Lemay chazi, what would charcoal be usable for? Then I will say, understand that, remember, as I mentioned in the Mishnah, they were not using charcoal to, it's clear that they did not use charcoal to cook on Yom Tov, because again, if they used charcoal to cook on Yom Tov, the Gemara wouldn't have said lemay chazi. What is it usable for? It's obviously what it's usable for. You want to grill, right? You want to cook on Yom Tov. So they clearly were not using charcoal for the sake of cooking. So the Gemara says lemay chazi. What is usable? Now remember, Rashi in the Mishnah already pointed out that what was charcoal used for? Charcoal was used for gold working. So the Gemara says, okay, you can't work gold on Yom Tov, so obviously you can't make charcoal on Yom Tov. Tani Rabbi Chia, no. Lo nitzruchat lo lemosran lu'ul yorin. Now I'll tell you what it was. What was usable for? To go ahead and make it in order to give it over. Rabbi say ul yorin are the bathhouse attendants. Rashi says over here ul yorin mechami chamin umer chatzos va'af agav v'tzorech Yom Tov hein osin. So I'll say, what happened? I want to make charcoal to give to the bathhouse attendants to heat up the bathhouse, which we'll see is permitted on Yom Tov. Again, also when you get into the discussion about bathing on Yom Tov, we touched on it a little bit earlier already. We'll talk about it later on in this Masechta. So I want to go ahead and give it to the bathhouse attendants to heat up the bathhouse for Yom Tov. Ubo bayom mishari. But is it permitted to go ahead and bathe on Yom Tov? Rashi says, umishari lahachim v'halo gozru ala rechitz b'mesech Shabbos v'afilu hochmim b'ma'od yom v'choshkin lahachim chamel lahod ramon. Rabbi said there is a rabbinic prohibition against bathing on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even with what? Even with water that was heated before Shabbos and Yom Tov. We saw this in the Masechah Shabbos. This was what's called the Gzeres Merchatz, because remember what was happening is originally people were bathing in water that was heated up prior to Shabbos and Yom Tov, and then what happened? The bathhouse attendants were in fact warming it up on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and were claiming they did it before. Therefore, the rabbis outlawed hot bathing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, so you can't do. So what are you doing? What do you mean you're making charcoal in order to give it over to the bathhouse attendants? The bathhouse attendants aren't allowed to warm up water on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even with, or actually this is really on Yom Tov. They're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov. To which the Gemara says, Kida Amar Rava Lahazia. Oh, what are we talking about over here? For the sauna. This is not for bathing. This is for the shvitz. The kodem gezerah, and we're talking about now before the gezerah. Hachenami lahazia v'kodem gezerah. Look at Rashi. Lahazia. Machnis hapichamen l'socho ubnei adam nichnasin l'maziyin kodem shegazra alazea nishnis mishnazu. So we'll listen to this. So again, apparently, even after they outlawed bathing, it was still permitted to go to the shvitz on Yom Tov. Therefore, Lemais, what the Gemara is talking about over here is this Mishnah was written, and then later on they outlawed usage of the sauna as well. So the Gemara says that this Mishnah was recorded prior to that Gezerah. So this Mishnah says that you can't go ahead and make Pechamin, even though what? Even though technically you might have thought that it would have been okay, since you could have given it over to the bathhouse attendants to use to go ahead and heat up the shvitz. Kamash Malon, you can't do it because the creation of the charcoal itself is like the creation of a kli. Okay?
Why couldn't the Gemara said it was before the first Gezerah? The regular Gezerah? Why does it have to choose a shvitz?
So, because the Gemara seems to feel that there's no way this Mishnah, because the Gezerah for the Merchatz was much earlier on. So the Gemara feels, I guess it's just chronologically, it's more feasible that this would have been before Gezeras, I guess Zeya, that's the wrong word, before Gezerah Lahazia, then before Gezeras Merchatz, chronologically. So the Gemara says, you can't cut the wick into two. So remember again, the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda said, you can't cut it with a knife, but you can cut it with a fire. So the Gemara says, why can't you cut it with a knife? Why? Because the Maisa, you are creating a utensil. The act of cutting a wick in two is creating a utensil because now you have created a functional wick. But you can make the same argument even if you singe the wick in the middle and go ahead and create two independent wicks. You are also creating a new utensil. To which the Gemara says, Tani Rabbi Chia, chotcha ba'ar b'fi shtei neros. Oh, what's the case of Rabbi Osai? You have one long wick that you need to make into two. So if you cut it, it's very clear that you are actively creating something. So what's the case over here? Where you have one long piece of material, you place the ends each in their own nair, in their own receptacle, and what do? You light the middle. So when you light the middle, effectively what ends up happening is the two wicks separate, but that doesn't have the appearance that you are actively creating two new wicks. Why? Because what are you doing? As far as you're concerned, your act has the appearance of just kindling the wick. Therefore, because it doesn't have the same appearance as creating something, therefore Rabbi Yehuda permits it. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Rav Nasr bar Abba Amarav, muchtin es hapsil b'yom tov. You are permitted to trim a wick on Yom Tov. My muchtin, what does that mean to trim a wick? Amarav Chinna bar Shalmi ha-mishmei derav la'aduye chushcha. To remove the charred part on the top. So I guess if you remove the charred part on the top, the wick will burn a little bit better. So you're permitted to do this on Yom Tov. Tani bar Kapra. Vadvam ne'emru b'psila. There are 6 things that were said about a wick. Gimel lahachmer v'gimel lahakil. 3 of them were stringent and 3 of them were lenient. So what are the 3 that are stringent? Ein godlinos lechatchila. You can't twist. I mean, you can't create a wick lechatchila, and you can't twist the fabric into a wick lechatchila on Yom Tov. That's fashioning it. Ve'ein mahavhavin. Osabar, you can't singe it in the fire. These are all things, either the creation of the wick or what allows it to ultimately burn. And you can't cut a wick into 2, thereby creating a wick. See, these are all 3 chumras that you can't do by wick because each of them effectively are creating or readying the wick for use. Lahakel, what are the kulas? You can press the wicks, meaning if it's already twisted, you could press it to make it a little bit more solid. V'shoren b'shemen, you could soak it in oil so that it burns better. And if you have the two ends of a long wick in 2 different utensils, you could singe the middle, you could kindle the middle and effectively make it into 2 different wicks. So we'll say now the Gemara quotes a different discussion only because it relates to some of the opinions we quoted earlier. Rav Nassan bar Abba said, in the name of Rav, Atire Bavel Yardei Gehenim. The rich men of Babel are going to Gehenim. Okay, good morning. Right, so now, I'll say, look at Rashi over here for just a moment. Yardim Gehenim Heim, She'ina Mirachamim Lasos Tzedakah. Because the rich men of Gehenna were men of means, they were wealthy individuals, but they did not give tzedakah properly. So Kiha, the Gemara tells a story, an example of this. Kiha, the Shabsai Bar Merenos, like the serf Shabsai Bar Merenos, what happened with him? Ikla leBavel, he went to Bavel. Ba'aminayu iska v'lo yahavile. So I will say he wanted iska. Iska means merchandise. But I will say what that means is Rashi says schora lehistaker lemachzis chas. What ended up happening is these merchants would take merchandise from wealthier people. They would sell it and they would split the profits in half. So apparently, Shabsai Bar Merenus could not get any business. No one would help him in Yom Tov. In Bavel. Mezon Namilo Zainu. So he couldn't get business. So if he couldn't get business, he wasn't able to make money. So he became a shtickle destitute. So what happened? No one would help him with food. No one would give him anything to eat. Amar Hani Me'erev Rav Kasa. So Shabsai Bar Merenus makes a very strong statement. He says these men must be the descendants of the Erev Rav. The Erev Rav, remember, refers to the group of Egyptians that left with the Jews when we left Egypt, and ultimately, again, were the source of many problems and difficulties throughout our years in the desert. So Shabsai Bar Merenus says people who are so uncharitable, people who are so unkind, they can't be really part of Klal Yisrael. They must be the descendants of the Erev Rav. And look what he says. I will say it's actually quite beautiful. D'chsiv v'nasan l'cha rachamim. The pasuk says over here, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give you rachamim v'nasan l'cha rachamim v'richamcha. Right, and you will be, and he will, or I should say, v'nasan l'cha, you will give you compassion v'richamcha, and you will be compassionate. Kol hamerachim ala brios, whoever is compassionate for others. It's such a beautiful Gemara. So the hallmark of the Jewish people is compassion. If you are compassionate, then ultimately, again, that shows that you are the offspring of Avram Avinu. And anyone who is not compassionate or empathic, it is clear that you are not from the descendants of Avram Avinu. There's a problem with your yichus. I will say the Gemara actually has a couple of different examples of things like this, where character traits say a lot about the people. So for example, the Gemara also says people who always get angry. It's actually very strong. The Gemara says people who have anger issues. The Gemara says chances are they're mamzerim. It's actually quite strong. Try that in your next fight, right? So because why? The Gemara says because anger is such a despicable midah, and people who have temper problems, that shows that there is a certain what we'll call a yichus or genetic imbalance within the individual. That's not the way a Jew behaves. If a person has that type of midah problem, that's a pegam in who they are. So the Gemara attributes it literally to mamzerus. Here, you're not empathic, you're not compassionate. There's something wrong with your Jewish DNA. It's off because it's part of our DNA from Avram Avinu to be compassionate and empathic. So therefore, I must be not a descendant of Avram Avinu. But Amrav Nasan bar Abba Amrav. So we'll say now the Gemara gets into a little bit more agadata. Rav Nasan bar Abba said in the name of Rav, Kala metzape al shulchan achirim olam chashach ba'ado. Rabbi say anyone literally who has to look to the table of another, which means anyone who is dependent on someone else, the world is a dark place for him. Shne'emar, no day to lechem aye. He looks around wondering, where is my bread? Yada kinachon biyado yom choshech. He knows that the day of darkness is readily at hand. So we'll say the idea that someone who, again, this doesn't even need explanation. Someone who is dependent, no worse feeling than having to be dependent on someone else. The world becomes dark. Rav Chisda Amar Av Chayov Einam Chayim. Rav Chisda says that again, I will say it's not just the pshat that his life is a little bit difficult, but such a life is not even a life. A person comes to a point where they feel that this is not even a life worth living. Tan Rabbanon, Gimel Chayehem Einam Chayim. Well, it's actually an amazing Gemara. There are three people, literally, whose lives are not lives, meaning three people whose existence is profoundly compromised. Ve'eluhin, these are the three people. Hametzapa l'shulchan chaveiro, someone who has to be dependent on his friend. Literally, he looks towards his friend table. This one is interesting. Umisha ishto mosheles alav, someone who has an overbearing wife. Right? So a person who has an overbearing wife, again, mosheles is actually a very strong lashon that she controls him, she rules him. So someone who has, I guess, the modern day equivalent is, well, I won't say it. Okay, so Right? I have to ask my wife. 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 Come on, make a decision. Right? I have to ask my wife. So, so someone ultimately, again, whose wife totally rules over him, and someone who experiences physical suffering. Right, so ultimately, again, I will say viso again, physical suffering also, which is quite interesting. We know a person physically suffers; it overtakes the entirety of their existence. V'yeshom is actually very interesting, and there are others who add a fourth. Misha lo ela chaluk echad, someone who only has one shirt. And I will say, what's the issue with someone who only has one shirt? So Rashi points out, chances are it'll become infested with lice. Because it'll become infested with lice, again, ultimately, this makes a person's life exceptionally difficult. The Tanakama, why doesn't the Tanakama include the one shirt person in his list? Efshar de me'ayin bimane. Because at the end of the day, you can always examine your clothing and go ahead and delouse it. Okay, says the Mishnah. Let's at least just take a quick look. We'll do the Mishnah, then we'll have to stop. You cannot go ahead. You can. Also, what the Gemara is talking about over here is when you used to roast a piece of fish or cook a piece of fish over the fire. Apparently, again, you can't cook fish directly on the metal because it'll burn the fish. So what they used to have to do is they used to have to put something between the fish and the actual piece of metal over which they were cooking it. So, for example, what would they do? They would often take a pottery shard, or for that matter, they take a piece of paper. It doesn't literally mean paper over here. It can mean parchment. It can mean a piece of flattened out reed. But they would take something, so you can't go ahead and break cheres. You can't break an earthenware utensil, and you can't go ahead and cut a piece of paper, litzlos bomaliach, to go ahead and to literally to roast a piece of fish on top of it. And the logic behind that is because the act of breaking the utensil, the act of going ahead and cutting the piece of paper, ultimately again is the fashioning of it into a kli. Ve'in garfin tanar v'kirayim, you can't go ahead and clean out. Tanar v'kirayim also means you can't clean out an oven. You know what? Actually, we're going to stop over here. We're going to pick up with the Mishnah in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. We're going to start the daf at 5:45 tomorrow. It's the only way to get through all of this. So we'll continue Das Hatzmacha on Monday. So tomorrow we begin 5:45 with the Mishnah.